Morning, everyone. So it's Monday morning after the bank holiday. I hope you all had a lovely bank holiday. It was glorious weather. It's a bit cold today. Just going to move this slightly. I'm freezing cold today. Anyway, so today we are going to look at Grace Darling. Now, Grace Darling is a particularly favourite one of mine because where she lived, I used to go every weekend. Now, when I was younger, I didn't know anything about Grace Darling to start off with. All I knew was that there was a fancy memorial to a lovely lady in the graveyard that I used to like to go and visit because it's very, very pretty, up in a village called Bamborough, which was very close to where I used to live. So, but that's now about 40 minutes from where I live. It's a nice drive out in the car when you can get up there. But there's a lovely museum up there, and that's to celebrate the life of a lady called Grace Darling, who did something very, very spectacular when she was 22. So, this is the story of Grace Darling. On the 7th of September in 1838. Oh, it was 7th of September 1838. Well remembered me. Grace Darling and her dad. The whole family lived on the Farne Islands, which are a group of islands just off the northeast coast, up near Bamborough, which was actually where she was from. They lived in a lighthouse called Longstone Lighthouse, and they knew of a shipwreck from a ship called the Forfarshire, which had run aground up there. There, I think, had been 65 people on board the steamer, which was the boat, but 9 people hadn't been rescued. They were still clinging to the rocks. The Royal Lifeboat people had sent out people to rescue them, but they hadn't been able to get everybody. They had come from Seahouses, which is a town closer to the sea than Bamborough. Bamborough's further up the coast, but they hadn't been able to get far out because the lighthouse, Longstone Lighthouse, is further out. The Farne Islands are further out to sea than Seahouses, but the lifeboat from Seahouses wasn't sturdy enough to get as far out as they needed it to get. And knowing this, Grace Darling told her dad that she thought it best that they tried to rescue the remaining survivors of the steamer. So here we go. Not many people know about Grace Darling today, but her fame hadn't just spread around the land, but around the world, and with good reason. Grace was the daughter of William and Thomasine Darling, just one of 9 children born into the family in the early 19th century. Aged just a few weeks old, they left their tiny cottage in the Northumbrian village of Bamborough and moved to the remote and desolate Brownsman Island, and then to the nearby Longstone Island, which, like I said, is one of the Farne Islands off the east coast of England, very close to the Scottish border. Her father had been running a lighthouse and was paid £70 plus a bonus of £10 each year. But for that, her family had to spend their time in lonely isolation, with William having to row back to the mainland to purchase even the most basic of things. The family would all live in the main room on the ground floor and then sleep in the 3 bedrooms up the winding staircase. The Farne Islands are in the North Sea, a treacherous and cold sea even in the summertime, and the conditions are well known to switch from a calm to a mountainous waves in just a few hours. In the early hours of the 7th of September 1838, Grace looked out of the window to see a ship that had been wrecked upon the nearby rocky Big Harker Island. It was the Forfarshire, a large paddle ship, also known as a steamer, and a terrible storm had blown it against the rocks and broken the ship in half, with half of it having already sank during the night, joining the many hundreds of ships that had met their end on the islands. Knowing the seas as they did, Grace and her father determined that it was far too perilous, that means dangerous, for the local lifeboat to be put out from Seahouses, which was the nearest mainland rescue centre. And so they decided to row out, which was over a mile away, in the stormy conditions amongst the islands and the jagged rocks, in a small 21-foot by a four-person wooden Northumbrian boat known as a cobble. That's a kind of boat. Finally, they reached the site of the wreck, and William Darling clambered onto the low-lying rocky island, leaving Grace to single-handedly keep the tiny wooden boat near the island whilst ensuring it didn't smash against the rocks. It should be remembered that the boat was designed for 4 burly men on a relatively calm sea, and not one young lady, barely out of her teenage years, battling one of the biggest storms of the year just after daybreak. That's the other thing to remember. It was only just turning light. And Grace Darling was only 22. The pair had already risked their lives just by venturing out in the first place, and one wrong move would have seen the boat rip apart and no doubt costing all their lives. Somehow, though, Grace held it together, and her father, William, managed to shove 4 men and the only lady survivor of the ruined paddle ship, and Mrs. Dawson, whose 2 young children had died in the accident. William and 3 of the male survivors rowed back to the lighthouse and dropped off Grace, Mrs. Dawson, and another survivor before William and the 3 others rowed back and rescued 4 more survivors. By now, an attempt was made by the lifeboat at Sea Houses on the mainland to effect a rescue, but all they found were the bodies of Mrs. Dawson's children and that of the vicar. The bad weather became worse still, and the Sea Houses lifeboat was forced to seek safety at the lighthouse at Longstone, and the storm was so great that all were trapped inside for 3 days until the seas calmed sufficiently for a trip to the mainland to be attempted again. The Forfar shore had been carrying 62 passengers. All those that had been rescued were from the bow section of the ship, which had been held above water by the rocks for some time. 9 others managed to get away on a ship's lifeboat, but that little craft sank in the storm, but thankfully rescued by the crew of a passing Montrose sloop and taken to South Shields that same night. News of the rescue and Grace's pivotal part in it hit the news almost overnight. Her bravery and yet simple, virtuous lifestyle made her an exemplary heroine. She received donations of £725, including £50 from Queen Victoria herself. And her dad got £175 from Queen Victoria. Artists from all over the world came to paint her likeness, and she received letters, gifts, and even marriage proposals from around the world. One of the best things that she got, though, which I think is quite funny, and actually, if you go to Grace Darling Museum, which is in Bamburgh, part of it is housed in her old house. Cadbury's made slips for, Cadbury's bar of chocolate. Well, the coverings of the bar of chocolates. They, in olden times, those slips went across the chocolate, so you could actually just pull them out of the chocolate, and they were covered in foil. They actually made slips that went over the bar of chocolate, and they actually made them so they had someone paint her portrait, and the slips had Cadbury's Grace Darling's chocolates written on them, and they slipped them across the bars of chocolate. And there is actually one in the museum. They've kept one, so you can go and have a look at that. They're really good. Sadly, though, in 1842, when Grace Darling was visiting her family who lived in Alnwick is about, it's probably only about 5, maybe 10 minutes drive away from Bamburgh, not even that really. No, it probably is. She was visiting her cousins in Alnwick. It wouldn't have been a drive. In 1842, it would have been a horse carriage ride. She was visiting her cousins in Alnwick, and she took unwell, so she went back to her home in Bamburgh, but she didn't recover. But hearing that she was unwell, the Duchess of Northumberland, who obviously lived at Alnwick Castle, arranged for the best medical officers to go and see to Grace Darling and make sure she had the best medical attention at the time. That was something that the Darlings couldn't have afforded at that time, because obviously you had to pay for medicines, and there was no such thing as the National Health Service then. but they couldn't afford it. So the Duchess of Northumberland paid for that for her, but there was nothing to be done. And sadly, Grace Darling died. But through the donations of the country and the nation, they put up a memorial, which is the memorial that I used to go and see most weekends when I went up to Bamburgh. It is one of my favourite places to go. That we see today. Thousands and thousands of people visited it from all over the world. It's still there. It is well worth a visit. I can heartily recommend it. And the Royal National Lifeboat Institute run the Grace Darling Museum. It's run on donations. Just recently they've built an extension to it, and it's purely run on donations. It's a fantastic museum. I was only there last year again. Like I said, it's one of my favourite places to go. And all of the family are buried in the cemetery at Bamburgh, and you can go and visit their graves. But it says in October 1842, she died, unfortunately, at the age of 26. So 4 years after this heroic deed that she did, she died. But she will be remembered. And there's also a Victoria Memorial to her on Great Farne Island. And there are poems about her. William Wordsworth wrote a poem about her, which is in the museum as well. There you go. That is the story of Grace Darling. I will see you again tomorrow. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.